Welcome to the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. Your one stop to learn about the technology that's powering the future of commerce. Here are your hosts, Dirk and Kelly.
Welcome to another episode of the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. I'm joined here in person for once with my co-host, Dirk Horrig.
Hi, Kelly. This is a rare occasion, actually, that we are both at the same location when we do the recording.
We're at Shop Talk this week. And today we are very excited to be joined by Brendan Gualdoni. He is Vice President of Enterprise Architecture, Commerce, and Integration at Express. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here, guys.
Can we get started? Maybe you can walk us through your background. How did you get to the seat?
Long story. I actually was a finance undergrad, and I started learning this great thing called Excel back in the late 90s. And there was a bug in one of the formulas. And at the end of this semester, I said to the professor, "This doesn't make sense. How do we fix this?" And they showed the underline where I can write code, and fell in love with writing code. And from then on, I was just self-taught writing software, and moved directly from, I never went into finance. I started writing software, went to technology companies. Started off at a company in Lincolnshire, Illinois. It was formerly Hewitt Associates, now Hewitt Aon, and I think it's now called just Aon, Benefits Consulting. So learned the big mainframe and got my feet wet in DB2, traditional batch work, a lot of SQL. From there, I learned Java, and then started to work on their Java platform, which, back then there was this thing called the internet coming on. And,
so you never wanted to get back to finance anymore from that point on?
No. Although now at the point in my career, it seems like I'm doing a lot more finance now than I was back then. Then from there, after I learned to hone my skills, I was recruited to go into .coms. There was the .com boom in, Chicago. And, kicked around from a couple .coms, had a lot of fun, broadened my skills quite dramatically, and realized that I was better actually at managing and building teams than actually writing the code, which was bittersweet because I still like to write code. From there, it was the 2009. Ironically, that was the year my first daughter was born. And I was at a .com that imploded, and I was laid off, and I landed a job at Sears Holding Company, which is now gone the way of Toys R Us and a couple other companies. And from there, got heavily into retail. My wife was always into retail, so I always had a love for it. Growing up as side jobs, I worked for many retailers. And there I actually was hired into the marketing side of the house, and which gave me that perspective of, it's not just about the bits and bytes or how fast I can write the best algorithm or what I can actually, do with the software. It's like, how is the customer using it? Because if you build something and nobody uses it, is it really useful? From there, was in Sears. I was in a company inside of Sears. They had all these startups, but it wasn't a traditional startup because you had millions of dollars to play with. And from then I went to Sears.com, so now the online business unit side of it, still on the marketing side, more traditional front-end development, managing front-end development teams. And because of my .com, I've learned everything from, traditional J2EE and DevOps and database and infrastructure. And now I was, getting more and more into front-end coding. The big thing back then was that, before AEM, CQ5. Mm-hmm. And we had this, holy war between CQ5 and WordPress. And the business units, the way they worked inside of Sears is if you could actually work as an agency and write software and make money for them, whoever could do it the fastest kept getting the budgets to do things. Mm-hmm. So had a successful WordPress stint. And then later in, it was 2012, 2013, there's a thing called single page app started to explode. This is before React. and we started playing with single-page apps and rolling our own APIs. That was a lot of fun because it took the best sides of what I had, which is how to do these data structures and how to expose it in an API, then also how to surface the correct way for the customer to actually use. Or if it's not a customer, it's an internal customer, whatever it might be. From there, I then went into product development for the APIs for a short time at Sears. And then in 2014, a couple ex-Sears guys recruited me to go work at Express. And from there, I was leading their e-commerce team. And it kind of just exploded a little bit from there. So I took over their mobile app, and then slowly realized when I took over that mobile app, there was some pretty basic things missing, like APIs to run applications. But as soon as we got that up and running, then we put in a CMS system, so taking over marketing tools and working with those tools. And then finally, I'm where I'm at right now, which is most recently running enterprise architecture, running e-commerce. We're deplatforming or decapsulation of commerce right now. There's so many different phrases, however you want to say it, but taking that big enterprise, that big box, and using the Kelly, you're the one who actually said it. I didn't realize what I was doing, the strangler pattern. I was just trying to make things work easier and just saw it clearly like, hey, if we're having a problem on, if it's my product detail page and I know that's where the conversion needs to drive and I need to make it faster and implement a new feature, well, I couldn't do that on my traditional JSP pages. It just took too much QA. It took too much time. And I had the luxury, since I was in marketing, because I still wasn't in IT, that they had budgets and they saw the need. I mean, they always had the need because they want to make money, but I was providing solutions and they were letting me change things. And as soon as you had one success, it just kind of grew from there. And now we're going to be launching Commerce Tools later on this year for our 2019 season. And I'm looking really forward to that.
Awesome. Quite a career. And you now already touched a lot of things, how I would say web technology has changed over the last 15 years and how the evolution looked like. I think this is a lot of stuff that we have to dive into in this session. But before we talk deeply about technology, I know almost everybody in the US does know Express. It's a huge company. Mm-hmm. But probably in Europe, where they're not that present, they're not that well known. Can you give a little bit introduction to the company?
Sure. So Express is a 30-year-old brand. It was born out of the limited companies, L Brands, based out of Columbus. I didn't realize Columbus was the retail capital of the U.S., which was a lot of because of Les Wexner and his vision of retail. So Limited was traditionally a women's store, and they needed a men's brand, which they launched Express. I think this is correct. It felt right. We were spun off from Limited Brands in 2008, and we were dual gender at that point in time. We have roughly 500 stores, give or take, between traditional retailer and EFO. Strong brand presence, because for the most of the time Express was around, there was one CEO who was very focused on what his vision was and what it really, meant to be. But yeah, to your point that it's not that well known. I mean, if I'm at Shop Talk and I'm talking to somebody and they're like Express, usually if it's a guy, he'll say, "Oh, my wife buys my jeans from there." Or they say, "Oh, are you in logistics or supply chain?" But then again, if I'm talking to a woman, she's just like, "Oh, I bought my first dress there." And it's this brand that's been around for, my generation, and people didn't realize it's still around, and we're still growing, and looking forward to grow it some more.
It's one of those few. It was one of the flagship mall brands that you would see. So you'd go into any shopping mall in the 80s and 90s and see it. But what I like about the brand is it's really reinvented itself and stayed fresh, and I think is a pretty good success story for surviving this apocalypse.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think you guys have really been hit with store closures or anything.
No, I mean, we like all retailers, I mean, we're trying to figure out that balance between online and brick and mortar. And what people are thinking is like, oh, it should be all online or it should just be app. Well, you can't have one without the other. I mean, we're seeing that right now where, Warby Parker is opening up, has a store in Columbus actually, and they started off online, and you need that customer interaction, or you need that place to even return something to, or just to go get fitted. I mean, we sell a lot of our men's businesses in suits. I cannot tell you how many times I've had friends ask, hey, I have a wedding. I want to have, just instead of renting tuxedos or whatever, we just want to buy, because we sell tuxes too, just buy them for them because they're at a good price point. They look great. And you need that store to get the altering and styling.
Yeah. And one differentiator is also, I think that Express realized very early on that technology might be a key differentiator, right? So one of the things that make you different than many others is that you almost do everything on your own, right? You have a very well-skilled in-house IT, skilled in-house development. So you're not that depending on anybody from externally to drive the innovation of the company. I think this is something that we also need to talk about later on. Yeah, definitely.
So what was your e-commerce journey from the 90s, from its very inception to today?
Static originally. There was this magical thing called HTML, which I thought was a toy. Same way I thought like PowerPoint was a toy. I didn't know if I knew HTML, I could immediately get a job, before .com. And then, the other thing in 2000, we had Y2K, which to my millennial users, yes, that was a real issue back then. I actually had an intern ask me what that was after a meeting, which then, that drove part of the career, and then got back into web development immediately after Y2K, just because, the amount of money and the need in that space. It went from, like I said, static HTML pages that were disconnected. You weren't even sharing CSS files or JavaScript files. Everything was separate, and you had to stitch together somehow. And then there was this magical thing of linking. And then, after you got that, it was like, okay, this is great, but now I want to do something else with it. So then you put a database in, and from there, started to learn Java and realized that, you can do transactions on this great platform, great software. The problem is that's when all these big enterprises were being developed, and they're like, okay, this is the way you talk to the database. This is the way you standard things, which is great. But at the same time, it just became more and more difficult to test software, to build QA environments, releasing software. I mean, how do you release software without downtime? That was, in the early 2000s, that was a big issue. And there were just teams that were just doing that. That was back when you really had release management. From there, my journey was after Java. When I went to .coms, I was brought into a .com to change it from PHP to Java. And, it was funny because the person who was interviewing me and says, hey, we need you to come and work for us. We want you to interview with our, director of engineering. So I did. Came back, talked to the owner of the company, and I'm like, you don't want me. He's like, well, why not? I'm like, it's written in PHP. I go, I write Java. So he said, you know what? Here's a book, the stack of O'Reilly books or whatever, and so I read it for, a weekend or whatever, like, oh yeah, I can do PHP. So then I dove into PHP. So I went from, this static to object-oriented to back to procedural. And then eventually, PHP became object-oriented. And then from there, I got into frameworks, WebSphere, worked on IBM, WCS, and then really dove heavy into content. There was, CQ5 before, Adobe bought it. Yep. But then the real power, since I was the front-end Java guy living in that content world and knew PHP, I was just like, listen, there's this magical thing called WordPress. And of course, that was like, oh, you can't use open source in the enterprise, and the CIOs of the world were like, no, there's vulnerabilities, there's everything. But luckily, since I worked for the marketing department, I'm like, hey, here's content, here's how you launch it, here's how you publish it. And what they loved about it is like, I enabled them and made it self-service. And once the, IT side of it understood that, at one point in time, 25% of the known internet was on WordPress, people started to realize this thing's actually powerful, and you have plugins and things you can use for it, but then you had to figure out a way to pay for these things. So then you dive back into transactional systems. And then how do you integrate between a content system and a traditional e-commerce system? Well, APIs. That was the logical step. But the interesting thing is people were like, how can you keep just pushing content and marketing and get to some place? I said, that's easy. I'll put product on this page. And they're like, well, that's only half of it. I said, what if I put an add to cart button? And then that was the game changer, because they were seeing that was a different funnel coming in, and that the contextual commerce, or whatever, content and commerce coming together. And then from there, once I landed at Express, it was another challenge, because it was another Java platform that I wasn't fully aware of. But since I've gone from one software to the next, it's if you're a chef, it doesn't matter if you're cooking on gas or electric or over a campfire, you can still make it work.
That answered actually a lot of questions that I wanted to ask on how you have seen the change of commerce platforms, and when open source came into the game, and so on. So now you are on the next journey from, let's say, decoupling monolithic architectures. And I think it doesn't matter. It's often one of the big four enterprise solutions that we see out there that had and still have great benefits. But we also see companies like yours more moving into a microservices kind of architecture and direction. Why is that?
Because software is expensive. I mean, and we're not a software company. We are a fashion retailer, and where they are actually going to put their more money and more of their creativity is in the product. It is in what that brand is. But they also realize they need technology and the digital side to actually power it. The big box enterprises were great because you could write up a business plan, and you could go to an SI and you knew how much it would cost, and you could plan this huge capital investment, and everybody couldn't wait for it. It was big bang. But then as soon as you got it up and running, it's like, okay, we're selling. Now what do you do? How do you drive more sales or change conversion or incentivize the customer? We have to add more features. And it became more and more costly to add more and more features. I mean, I think there was the famous Best Buy that it took $1 million to add the link on the PDP page. Not that we've spent $1 million doing that, but things get into seven figures, and executives get worried about that. So when you propose a solution that's no cost on the marketing side, at least from software or just internal developers doing it, it was a real game changer. And then once you embrace microservices and go headless, then it really starts changing. And where we're seeing the speed of iteration and features being developed and released faster is because we are headless, but then also not just headless of, hey, we're going to be API driven. That's just part of it. That's just the data layer. That's an enabler. Where the real changer is the guys who are writing the front end code, giving them access to the integration layer. So now I'm talking about GraphQL and the amount of companies that are talking to us via our product team that want us to put this feature or this piece of software on our site. I mean, now that's a disqualifier. Well, if you don't have APIs, yes, we have APIs. Are they REST? Do you have an API gateway? And then it's become, do you have GraphQL? Can you enable GraphQL? Because I can't tell you, I mean, at Shop Talk, I'm sitting there talking to some people and they're like, test our software. It's easy. Just drop some JavaScript on the page. It doesn't work anymore. It really doesn't. And I'm happy it doesn't work anymore because dropping that JavaScript on the page caused more headaches than problems.
One of 85 tags. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, hey, your page is really slow. Is it your code? No, it's because some marketer did some tag management and blew the whole thing up. But one thing that it really did is where traditional engineers understood, memory leaks and things like that in objects and in heap sizes. If I can get to that really nerdy direction. You had the same thing. It's just that in front end, they just weren't seeing it because the browser was the one doing the memory leaks. Well, if you have a better framework to use and it's driven in a way where you can control your data structure, and I'm talking about the ORM layer, you have less memory leaks. For example, when we went headless, well, before we were headless, some of our pages had, 40, 60% JavaScript errors. The customer didn't see it, but it would slow everything down. Once we implemented a single page app architecture, we are now 3-4% JavaScript errors on the page, which is to the credit of actually the engineers who built it. Because the other thing that it, besides JavaScript making it slick and fast, are now some of the open source tools that you can compile it and then you can put unit tests in there. I think we have, upwards a couple thousand unit tests in just our front end layer. And the confidence that the product and marketing and business side has from the team that it's actually going to release correctly, or the design pattern of, hey, there's a circuit breaker, or there's what I call them levers, is you can release whatever feature you want just as long as there's a lever and the default is off. Because you release it, no bugs, good, turn it on, see what happens, and then, maybe it's wrong, maybe the integrator wasn't ready for us. You don't have to roll back the code, you just turn it off.
It's completely revolutionary. So how slow were your releases before microservices and then after? What have microservices and APIs done to your velocity in terms of releasing?
Yeah. So back 2014, 2015, we were releasing once a month, sometimes, 6 weeks. And part of that release wasn't writing code. It was actually the long testing efforts in multiple environments. So we were about a month into it. Nowadays, I think, which today is Tuesday, I think we've released twice this week already. So
Awesome.
Now we're up to daily releases. Daily is as needed. We do have schedules. So since we're a multiple stack with a content management system or digital experience platform, whatever they're calling it nowadays.
Let's dive into that. How does your stack look like?
So if and I'm not giving anything away because anybody who has a browser can actually figure this out. The homepage and that experience layer is Adobe Experience Manager. And those are the landing pages, and that was another enabler for the rest of the organization. So it got the front-end engineers out of the traditional marketing and what I call coloring and designing of the pages. Then you go deeper in the stack, starting from product detail page. Now we're into React framework. And then the back end is traditional Java with APIs on top of that. We have and then multiple SaaS partners. With our search engine is a SaaS partner. And then all the other features, there's always this build versus buy mentality. Well, I'm not going to build everything, but I can integrate just about anything now into this framework. So when we release, I'd say, still the enterprise stuff, the content pieces is probably every other week if needed, maybe once a month. It doesn't have to change that often because there's enough templates and components there. The React, we can release as often as we want, sometimes multiple times a day. And then on the API services layer, right now we're at a schedule of Tuesdays and Thursdays, just because that feels like a good pace. But if needed, we can do it every day. And sometimes we do.
Awesome. As you mentioned earlier, GraphQL. What's your take on that?
GraphQL is a game changer. Before you had, the single page architecture, and you were still relying on that back-end engineer, and they were developing APIs specific for channel, whether it was mobile or an integration layer or the website. Now you say, hey, service-based engineer, write this API, RESTful, obviously, or hopefully, in most cases. But then on the front end, the GraphQL engineer, the JavaScript engineer, can pick and choose what they want. So you put the almost the power in the client side and saying, yes, I need this API and this API, but I only need these fields, 4 or 5 fields from it, and then stitched it together and give me one response back. So it makes it a lot more powerful. It's an integration layer. And a lot of companies, I think yours is one of them, is adopting it, which is just making things a lot easier to work with. I had some engineers, last fall during holiday, where they took Commerce Tools and they took a, rudimentary, not our React framework, but just a simple front-end React framework, and were working directly against Commerce Tools, going from that browser directly to GraphQL, nothing in between, no lag. Yep. It just worked, and how fast they could actually put up a transactional website.
I liken it to like if you were querying a database, but you couldn't select from multiple tables and you had to select each table. Yeah. We're very bullish on GraphQL. We're sponsoring GraphQL in Europe again. And personally, I'm writing a book on GraphQL. So, personally spending, some brain power on it.
The interesting thing that I like about GraphQL, it's not just, the API stitching them together. GraphQL can talk to a database. It can talk to a file.
Anything, yeah.
And that's you're seeing now, there's a company called, I think it's Prism, that actually is a
Prisma, right?
Yes, yeah. It has the like a SQL for GraphQL talking to a database.
Yeah.
And at first I was kind of scared, but then I started thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? So that's that next evolution, really.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense. So a question about microservices. Oftentimes, organizations have very legitimate needs around legal issues, around procurement. There are a lot of corporate interests, but at the same time, one of the central tenets of microservices is that each team should be relatively free to pick the technology and the implementation that they want. So you've verticalized your development teams internally. How do you draw the line between this is a corporate decision, thou shalt not use this license, right? Or you can't use AWS, or pick your thou shalt, but how do you draw that line and still give them freedom to innovate?
Right. First and foremost, it starts with the staff, the resources. We're a traditional Java shop. So we're going to have a lot of our microservices written in Java. We are building a big React team, which we could build those same services in JavaScript. Leading enterprise architecture, one of the lines in the sand that I put out there is if it's a transaction, I need that synchronization. I need Java. If it's asynchronous, I can use JavaScript. If I'm going to go serverless, I should be JavaScript just because the startup time is so much faster. And those are just kind of basic tenets. But really where it comes down to is who is not only building it, but who's going to maintain it. And if I made the decree that every microservice should be in JavaScript, I could probably have my Java engineers build it. But when it comes time to actually debug it and really scale it, I might, hit a gap with that. Your question though about you dipped your toe in a cloud for a second there.
Well, a lot of organizations say that you can only use GCP, right? For example, or AWS. So how do you do you allow teams to go pick the cloud they want, right? Could they go use, I don't know, Rackspace or
or Azure.
Azure. Right? That was kind of mean, but we'll not dive into that now.
Back to Express as a retailer. And the interesting thing with us is we design and manufacture only Express clothes, and you can only buy Express clothes from Express. So while other brands, can sell on multiple different platforms, that's where they're the fear of Amazon and AWS, because they don't want to feed the competitor, if you will. I don't look at them as a competitor because they are selling everything. We're selling fashion, and where GCP is great and Azure is great, and I like a lot of the other clouds. AWS was first, and they have the tools of the retailers because AWS was built for a retailer. It was built for Amazon. So if you think about it, if you say, hey, you can only use Azure, well, you're going to step into the cloud, but you're not going to actually get to the point where you're enabling the team and leapfrogging the competition because you're taking advantage of the things that Amazon has already done. I mean, anytime most of my software development career has been online, e-commerce specifically. And when we see a problem on a web page, what do? We look at the competition, because, if you're at a startup, we didn't have UX or maybe one designer in the whole place. We went and saw how Amazon did it, and we're like, oh, that makes sense. Let's give that a try. And then once you see the revenue come in, then it's just rinse, wash, repeat. So, it's not so much of fighting them or, having huge conferences or talking about how we can all, beat Amazon or all join together against them. Some of the things that they're doing is revolutionary. And if you're not taking advantage of those things, then you're quite honestly going to get left behind. Or not only left behind, you might say, well, I'll wait because this other cloud's going to have it in 6 months or whatever, or next year, but then you lose your time to market. And then everybody else is already at that point in time. You don't have your differentiator, and you don't have that momentum of moving forward because you've lost it and everybody else is doing it. Now you're just playing catch up.
And one thing that you definitely have in common is you also do your development in-house. And many brands and retailers actually are relying on external SIs. How did it come that you have your IT stuff, the Java developers, the JavaScript developers, and so on, that all that knowledge in your house?
That not an easy question, Dirk.
Sorry.
Back to where we're a fashion retailer. We don't have a lot of money to spend on technology. I mean, we do spend on technology. There is budgets for it, but where a lot of huge enterprises, pigeonhole some of these engineers because they have this certification and that certification. And, eventually when you're looking for that engineer, it's like, oh, I need that Hybris engineer or something like that. Well, if you step back and say, hey guys, you're writing Java, you could write it in Spring, or you could write it in Spring Boot, or you talk to the front end engineers and they're coming up with, jQuery was another game changer, and they're using all these different functions and they're making Ajax calls. So it wasn't that hard of a step to actually change that mindset. There were key players that I had to hire that were catalysts for that game change. So one of the big things was DevOps. We didn't have development operations or DevOps there, or any concept of software reliability engineering. So because of my network, I brought in a DevOps expert, built a team. Then once we saw we needed, and we're on that journey to go to the single page app, to go to headless, I brought in an expert in single page architecture. And then it just started mushroom from there. And then once everybody started the excitement in seeing like, hey, those guys are getting the cool projects, guess what? Engineers inherently, there's two different types of engineers, that mindset. There's that engineer who was, I'm in school, what kind of job do I want? Oh, software seems like it's a good career because I can make money out of it. Or there's that other type of engineer who's the tinkerer. and just wants to learn, and it's a constant learning process and trying to, how can I better myself and keep moving forward? And when you incubate those people all together, they're going to cross-pollinate and start realizing, hey, I can do things differently. I can do it faster. And if I want to get the cool project, we're going to have to work on it in a different area. The other thing, the cultural change was giving engineers the permission to break things. A lot of organizations had SLAs that, no bugs, can't go out with any bugs. Well, I mean, that just doesn't work anymore like that. If you give them permission to break things, within reason or in lower environments perhaps, then they become more and more comfortable of learning and adopting new software. And then, throughout the journey, I had to bring in experts to do demos and proof of concepts to actually get people comfortable with these new ideas and how it's going to work.
I like that you guys are able to invest in your people, and you don't see that with a lot of retailers. And I work for a retailer. It was actually my very first job, and they would balk at $60,000 a year salaries. Yeah. They'd never send people to conferences, and it's because they're managed like a traditional retailer, right? They just didn't see that. Yeah. Right. And the folks you're talking about make more than that, and they're worth it. Oh, right? Yeah. Because think of how small of a team, relatively speaking, compared to the thousands and thousands of folks out there in physical stores, and digital channels can, with a hundredth of the staff can do 10 times more. Well,
you said it correctly. I mean, it's investing in the people, and if you have, if you're a chef, for an example, and you're making great meals and you're an entree chef. I don't know what that's actually called, but it doesn't mean you can't do pastries. You just learn. And if you make one bad, you just throw it away, try, do it over again. And it's giving, like you said, it's giving those people the incentives to do it. It's letting them, whether it's sending them to a conference or saying, no, it's okay to, expense books. I mean, it seems so simple, but why not just hey, here's this. My favorite thing was these O'Reilly subscriptions that I keep plugging O'Reilly, but I've learned a lot of my career just studying and demonstrating it and showing it to the rest of the engineers. And now we're at the point where everyone in the staff we form these things called guilds, and a guild is essentially just a safe space where if you have a technology or something you want to work on, and you can showcase it to the rest of the engineers. And now we have engineers competing for time to actually show some of the new things that they want to do.
Like the Spotify model, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that builds their confidence. So you take it from, hey, I'm a back-end engineer, to now getting them into full stack polygon engineer, but then changing that mindset just a little bit, saying, okay, you need to think about how you're going to operate the software. So I'm talking about the DevOps space. How am I going to release and maintain the software? You're getting to the next level up, and then take it even one step further. And this gets back to, I've been from a marketing organization, not a traditional IT organization, even though I'm in IT right now, is starting thinking product focused. How is the customer going to use it? Who is our customer? Would you use this if you were a customer? So now you have an engineer who, you said went from $60,000 of just knowing Java. Now they know DevOps, they know front-end technology. They can do an ROI analysis on product. And now some of our ideas in-house come from our engineers, where they've seen things on other sites and like, hey, why don't we do this? And we, besides the guilds of training and sharing information, we've also have a centralized area for innovation now. Because, like I said, we're not going to build everything, but customers want all these new features, whether they're omni or, frictionless, whatever you want to call this new flavor of retail that we're in. We need to test these things out and figure out where the priority is. And we have to, funnel that in a direction, because there's, 10 players who can do returns. There's, I don't know how many players who can do tag management, whatever it might be, but not all of them are, the right one to choose. So you need to gate it a little bit.
Yeah, agreed. So what are some new channels that you're really excited about? At Shop Talk, everybody's talking about voice, VR, AR. I mean, pick your buzzword, but realistically, right, as somebody who's responsible ultimately, what is your decision-making criteria, and what are you particularly excited about channel-wise?
While all those things are great, they're still not mature enough to actually making money. They're good marketing things, and we've done AR things. We haven't really dove into voice, although I have a lot of people asking me about, hey, this is how it should work, this is how it should work, but there's no cases to actually say, is this the right way to make money using these channels? I think that for us, it's still about solving the same pain points that everyone has. Meaning, I'm buying this product, I want to return it, I want a different product. How fast can I get it? Even though everyone's omni-enabled right now, not everyone's running omni as smooth as it should be. And I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in most organizations, just fixing the run the store model. Because if I have pricing, I have promotion, I have product. If I have good product, which is what our company is known for, I just need to enable the other parts of the store. Can I get the inventory to them quickly? Can I change the site quickly? Can I give Kelly you a sale and Dirk give you a different coupon to come to the store, and making revenue and flowing it through? There's still a lot of work to be done just there before even diving into the buzzwords. But really, if I can throw out the other buzzword or the new elephants in the room at Shop Talk or any other conference, AI. AI to me is still far out. We haven't even figured out how to clean up our data lakes and comb through that to get to the clear water or the purified water.
When isn't AI supposed to do that for you?
Yeah.
And solve world hunger?
No, yeah. And solve the water shortage too. No, you first need to get to machine learning first, and then eventually you could get to AI. But until you're there, and what I mean there is, yes, there's all these technologies, and I was talking to somebody today, and they said they have a returns algorithm, and I'm like, what does that mean, and how does it learn? They're like, we use AI, and I'm like, okay. How does it work?
So you don't decide what you want to return on your own, just the algorithm decides to? The blue shoes don't fit you well.
Yeah, they don't look good with your outfit. Yeah. No, it was more so about, this one was like, if something to return happened, where should it go? Should it go back to the warehouse? Should it stay in the store? And to me, I was just like, why do you need AI to do that? Or why do you need machine learning to do that? You can write a simple algorithm, or or something as simple as, enterprise architecture. At its core, you have data, you have processes, you have an application, you have infrastructure. Well, that same data, that came in is like, here's a return. The process for that store.
It's pretty rule-based, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Even though they can see the patterns, which then eventually they do get to an ML light version. But it really is, I think that's more so the next thing. Because until you clean up your data so you can enable marketing again to drive more revenue. And then once you drive more revenue, then we can start tackling some of the cool buzzwords of the next generation.
Great. Thanks for sharing all the experiences that you have made. And we wish you all the success for what's coming up next, and also the next iterations of the Express Commerce platform. So thank you so much for your time. We're running out of time now because we all have to get back to the Shop Talk conference, and I saw almost all of our phones ringing while we had this episode recording. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks Brandon again for taking the time, and thanks Kelly for doing that.
My pleasure. Thank you guys.